Hello, my name is Johnke, and I'm going to be doing my speech, my ceremonial speech for Fundamentals of Speech. What if I were to tell you that one man helped influence all modern fantasy? What if I were to tell you that his books created an entire franchise of movies, games, video games, board games, and if you haven't guessed by now, this man is J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien was an amazing author who had tons of influence on many things. I'm going to be going over 3 points. So first, he influenced literature in general. Second, he influenced fantasy. And third, he had an influence on the entire world. To begin my first main point, according to Christian history, a volume of books that is talks about history of a bunch of different Christians and stuff like that, talked about J.R.R. Tolkien because he did have an influence on Christianity as well. But it mainly talked about how he created an entire genre of books. He created the epic fantasy, which is an entire subgenre of fantasy in which a character goes on an epic journey and they have to be trialed amongst a bunch of different things. And before that, not many fantasy books went in that category. It was kind of, fantasy alone wasn't very popular back then. And then when he created Lord of the Rings, it created an entire new genre of fantasy. It changed the way people viewed fantasy, and since Lord of the Rings was released, it became one of the most influential series on literature of all times. A book titled Tales Before Tolkien is a book that is trying to, it tries to find the roots of where Tolkien's writings come from and who influenced Tolkien. And it compares fantasy from before Tolkien published his books to after when Tolkien published his books. And you can see before Tolkien's books how fantasy was there wasn't many fantasy books for the amount of authors there were. And then there was Tolkien, and then tons of fantasy authors started popping out like crazy, and fantasy just kind of exploded. And if you were to look at the fantasy beforehand too, it wasn't anything similar to what modern fantasy is like. So he completely twisted the way that fantasy was seen and perceived by the public. Now I'm going to be moving on to my second point, that he had a huge impact on fantasy. So if you look at the number of fantasy books, as I stated before, before and after Tolkien, you can see that, how much fantasy was impacted. If you pick up a book for yourself from before the 1940s, when he published Lord of the Rings, and after, you'll see that almost every fantasy book you find will have some sort of influence from Tolkien. And then his books also led to not just growing of fantasy books, but he also grew the fantasy genre as a whole. So now there are more fantasy themed video games, fantasy themed board games, such as Dungeons and Dragons, and any other video game or board game that you can name that has fantasy roots probably can be tied back to J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien is to fantasy as the Beatles are to rock, is one way that I look at it. Because Tolkien, you can't look at fantasy without looking at Tolkien, the same way you can't look at rock without seeing Elvis Presley or the Beatles. And then this will move on to my third point, that he influenced the entire world. An article on Forbes compared New Zealand is the place where the Lord of the Rings movies were filmed. And New Zealand, from before and after the Tolkien's were released, their economy has actually been booming ever since the movies were released, because their tourism is New Zealand's second biggest industry. And ever since Lord of the Rings, that has only been growing larger and larger. More tourists are going there to see where the Shire is in real life and things like that. And it has had this positive effect. And of all the tourists that New Zealand gets, 1% of them said that their sole purpose was to go because of Lord of the Rings. That 1% equals almost $27 million. And that's what I'm talking about, the other 99% that could have been influenced. As one of the deciding factors of going on the trip to New Zealand was because Lord of the Rings was filmed there. So all these people are going to New Zealand, having a positive influence on that, even though it was a British author and his books are seen worldwide. New Zealand has been positively affected by that. And then other influences he has had influences on sci-fi, language, music. He's even influenced food. So the way he's influenced science fiction is by, so George Lucas, one of the producers of Star Wars, he said that one of the planets, Endor is actually Elvish for Middle Earth. So George Lucas actually derived one of his planets on Star Wars to be named after Middle Earth. So not only does he affect fantasy, but he affects science fiction. And he's had huge influence on language as well. He's added a few words into the dictionary, such as a few complicated ones that I can't even begin to pronounce, and then things like Hobbit and the Shire have also been put into the English dictionary. And he's an influence on music as well, because he has a lot of poems in his writings, and those poems have been turned into songs and different pieces of music, along with the soundtracks that go along to his movies. And the rock band Led Zeppelin has had multiple songs that have been derived from his works, and they've been themed and named and written after some of the themes that are seen in his writings. So to conclude, J.R.R. Tolkien is a great author. He deserves this toast because of his impacts on literature, fantasy, and the world in general. You can't talk about fantasy or literature in general without talking about J.R.R. Tolkien because of this massive impact he's had worldly, and traces of his works will always be found and throughout the ages. Thank you for listening to this speech.